In this video, I want to document the creation of my entry into the second Brackeys 2020 Game Jam. I'd only picked up Unity game design 2 months earlier, and this was the first game jam I ever entered. So the theme was announced, and it was Rewind. I immediately began brainstorming, and after the pretty obvious links to time and cassette tapes, I identified YouTube Rewind, a Twilight Zone episode, and a music festival with that name. After 15 minutes, I had the idea of a platformer where you control several characters that each have different limitations. After getting through and changing the level with one character, you would rewind and be able to experience the same level again with a spin. Somewhere in that idea, I also envisioned a device that characters could carry and which would rewind back through the level. After some more thought, I realized I didn't want to deal with the physics side of creating good character controllers, so I shifted to a top-down game concept instead. Keeping the rewinding device and multiple characters, I fleshed out the idea of a puzzle game where carrying and cleverly handing off the device was required to get through the levels. About 45 minutes in, I booted up Unity and started with player controls and a basic scene management system. I added multiple characters, and about 2 hours in, I was able to cycle between characters and control each one individually. I added buttons that could be pressed and items that could be picked up and dropped off. Then I created the functionality for the device. After being picked up, it would save its current position to a stack every 0.5 seconds. When the player dropped it, it would then retrace these points one by one until it reached its original position. Of course, my cats required some attention as well. With that in place, I went back to the paper to think up a few basic levels where this device was needed to advance. I came up with walls that became passable when the device was near. Here's my first implementation of that feature. After some more cat petting, I implemented a line renderer to display the device's magic aura, and built out my first level idea where you had to free the blue character by walking through the walls with red and then letting go of the device. When it returned its path through the walls, blue was able to escape. I also quickly realized that I couldn't allow the player to switch characters while one of them was carrying the device, as otherwise he could essentially stand in the doorway and hold it open for the other character to pass through. And that concluded day 1. I lost half of day 2 to a family event, but returned to work on graphics. Since I absolutely can't draw, the only option I saw was pixel art. I opened up Photoshop, and since the mechanic I had implemented so far lent itself to some sort of covert ops theme in my mind, I went with the characters being secret agents. With my character done, I started moving around and redrawing parts of it to create idle and run animation frames for each of the 4 directions. After over 5 hours of drawing, I had a complete sprite sheet. I imported it to Unity and started working on the animation controller. Another 90 minutes later, I had a working animated character. I made a variant of the same sprite sheet with a blue tie for my second character and set that up as well. With my characters ready to go, it was time for the background. I decided to go with tile maps for easier level creation. I made a bunch of different pattern variations, but only ended up using 4 of them. With that, I felt really good about my progress and decided to get some rest. I lost a lot of day 3 again, but managed to spend some time on the game after all. I made an exit tile and worked on functionality to detect when all exit tiles had a character standing on them to trigger the end of the level. That took a lot of time. Once I finally got it working, I fleshed out my game manager script to handle all of the operations required once the level finishes, like loading in the next scene's characters, interactables, storing them, and all that fun stuff. With that working, day 3 was done. I started off day 4 by getting rid of the line renderer to display the device's aura and using a point light instead. I continued to work on lighting and placed a few placeholder lights to light the scene. I then started working on the UI. With a rough look of a dialog box in place, I continued on the backend for a dialog system. Following the Brackeys tutorial, I set up dialog triggers as well as animation for the dialog panel. Next up was music. I had previously shortly played around with Soil, so I knew a little bit about how it worked. I started with some basic bass rhythms and added more as the song went by. To me it sounded like a fitting mystery vibe. Finally, I wanted to add some chords as the main melody, which I struggled a lot with. I ended up with 8 chords that sounded very dramatic. While this didn't really fit the vibe and theme of the game, I couldn't come up with anything else, so I left it in there. In total it was a 1 minute 45 second song that looped the entire time. Again, following the Brackeys tutorial, I implemented an audio manager and took it upon myself to record some sound effects. Here's me recording a footsteps sound that I ended up scrapping later. I swapped over to drawing the device as an orb and gave it a small sprite sheet so it would bob up and down and appear to change brightness. Next up, I started modeling out a menu scene, which meant I had to draw this beautiful background image. With the menu done, I put together a quick intro text scene and went back to recording some more sound effects. Here are a few different tries for the pickup sound of the orb. Sticking with my tendency to flip-flop between areas, I next decided to start designing pop-ups that would teach the player character controls. I drew keyboard keys in Photoshop and put them together on little panels. As it had been a very productive day, I left it at that. Day 5, I created fade in and out animations for these panels and wrote a script that would keep track of when these would pop up, what button the player had pressed, and when the panels should disappear. After that, I figured it was time to build out the first 2 levels properly, with the first one having no puzzle to it and just being there to teach the player the controls, and the second one being where the player would find the device and be taught the basic functionality of it. With those out of the way, I arrived at one of the hardest tasks, coming up with interesting level designs. I thought up a button that would open a door when the device was near, and finally a rocket launcher that would always shoot towards the device, so in order to get past destructible walls, the player had to position themselves and the device in the right way. This process took a long time. Once done, I went back to Photoshop to design a drawer that the device would pop out of. Of course, I can't stay on one part of the project at a time, so I then went into writing a system that would detect when the player had managed to get stuck. This was when the only way out was using the device, but none of the characters had access to it. The system essentially used a set of box colliders per level and counted how many characters were colliding with them. If it was both of them and the device was sitting at its origin, then the system would throw a stuck dialog and restart the level. Once more, another day was done. On day 6, I drew the button and door I needed for the next levels. Under the watchful eyes of my cat, I continued with creating a rocket launcher. I wrote a script including aim and reload times, rotating to always face the device, and a line renderer drawing a targeting beam. I made a placeholder tank-like sprite and put it in the game. I struggled to no end designing the correct rotation, which led to situations like these. Once I'd fixed that, I drew a rocket and wrote a small script which would just move the rocket forward and destroy on collision. Once more, rotation was my arch nemesis, as you can see. I finally got everything to rotate correctly, meaning I could move on to drawing a small destructible wall tile set and putting it in the level. Struggling with collision detection for a while, I eventually returned to recording sound effects for shooting the rocket and its explosion. That done, I started building out my last level. Realizing that a player should be able to die when hit by a rocket, I drew a tombstone and wrote the script to spawn it on player collision and restart the level. Next up, it was time to write the scripted sequence that would play once the player had made it through the final level. Implementing all of this functionality again took a long time. This included recording more sound effects like footsteps, building out more of the level, setting up lights in the scene, and putting together an outro text screen. Finally, it was the last day of the jam, and my game still needed a lot of polish. I went straight into Photoshop to design an animated monitor, a sprite to replace my placeholder rocket launcher, a desk, a chair, a bin, a flower pot, a rug, and placed them all around my levels. I went back into Bosca's soil to put together a short ending jingle. With my game being in a somewhat playable prototype state, I asked a few friends to playtest my game. I struggled for a while to export to WebGL, in part because I had unknowingly been filling up my C hard drive with footage for this video, but eventually got the game up on itch.io. Seeing what my friends struggled with, as well as the feedback they gave me themselves, was invaluable for determining what I needed to work on to get this game to a non-buggy and possibly even enjoyable state. The next hours were a flurry of bug fixes, quality of life improvements, writing dialogues, and setting up lighting for each level. Eventually it was 5 AM and I had achieved everything I could for the day. It was time to export once more and fill out the game info page on itch.io. At 6 AM, 6 hours before the submission deadline, I finally hit submit. Exhausted, relieved, and happy I'd managed to finish my game, I immediately went to sleep. This week was an insane experience with lots of setbacks, frustration, but also a sense of fulfillment when I managed to overcome issues and bugs, and in general for creating something that I could be proud of. I definitely plan on participating in future game jams again. If you want to play Infiltration, follow the link in the description. Thanks for watching.